Good morning, everyone. Good morning, or good evening. Good evening, morning, evening. It is sometime between the hours of midnight and 11:59. That's all I know. This is supposed to go so much smoother, and largely I blame everything on myself. So I originally had planned to make one particular topic of Mortiel Fallacy, which got pushed back till next week because I totally forgot that it was the 1 year anniversary of Mass Effect Andromeda. So I thought it would be kind of fitting to actually kind of share a lot of my thoughts on why I stopped playing the game, why I stopped streaming the game. And of course, there's a lot of people who probably question that, haven't seen any tweets or any comments I made on it, so not everybody's seen things on the same venues and such. For those who don't know, quick explanation, my YouTube channel largely started its initial growth from making build guides and strategy guides for Dragon Age Inquisition's multiplayer, which I did that quite a bit. And then I had all the intentions of continuing that same venue, in fact amping it up considerably for Mass Effect Andromeda's multiplayer when it came out. Super hyped about it. Everything was going awesome. I actually was like, I felt like I was upping the quality so much. I had learned so much in between those two games, and things were kind of looking positive in many ways. But not all was sunny and cheerful and everything. First of all, the major issue that I had was that how do I put it properly? From my opinions, the way in which Andromeda was handled was not something that I particularly thought was good. So as a result, I ended up pulling my support from it. I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So, and a lot of people don't know the story behind that. So that's kind of where I'm going to go on here. And I figured, why not? I'll share it with you guys. So I'm still working with the new format here, trying to get everything set up right. I realized my lighting's a little funny, so bear with me here. I'm getting the kinks sorted out because this has been a long day. So anyway, we're kind of gonna get into it here. So the first bit on here, if my brain work, let's go ahead and get our browser pulled up here. There's a lot of text on here, and we're going to be skipping across parts of this. I'll have a link in the description of this video if anybody wants to read the whole thing, but this was a blog I wrote in my fury of wanting to stop supporting the game, and I'll kind of touch on a lot of the reasons why. This was my overall disappointment of the game. This is a piece of literature written by someone who was coming to terms with their own cognitive dissonance. It's really what it was about, is that I was wanting to not believe that this game could be what it was. And unfortunately, it was exactly that. So we're going to kind of read through some of this and kind of get a lot of the highlights of it. And I'm going to kind of discuss it. So as my anniversary present to the game, so to speak, I wouldn't call it a present so much as it's an esoteric gift of sorts of what this game did wrong and what it could have done much better. So in any case, we're going to get to that. That's going to be a big part of tonight. We're going to try to get through it, and yeah, we'll see how that works. In any case, so we'll skip the preface on here, as I'm sure many of you have probably already read quite a bit of it as we've been sitting here. So we're not going to worry about the preface here. it's all just opinions and such. But so we're gonna go down to the actual opening on here. Yeah. And the main thing on the opening here when I talk about this is I want to make sure it's clear on here. I'm kind of one of those people that's always a rather independent-minded person. I'm not a big believer in taking one side and sticking to that side always. Any person, especially like someone involved in science, will tell you that positions can change as time goes on. It's one of the reasons why in politics I hate the fact that becoming a flip-flopper is like some kind of derogatory term. It's like, no, if someone shows me that my opinion or my beliefs, my views are wrong and demonstrates to me that they're wrong, I should change my position. But a lot of the viewpoints in a lot of the world today is that you're weak somehow. You have a weak moral character if you change your position, even if that position was a wrong one. But that being said, Mass Effect Andromeda has been a game of unparalleled and divisive controversy. Even the months leading up to launch, there were lines of people in camps looking for both ways to love and hate the game. It was abundantly clear that this game had a lot of passionate people anticipating its launch. Unfortunately, the game made a really poor first impression on people due to issues that were anywhere from aesthetic to like facial animations to tedious like the stellar flight animations to game-breaking bugs like the multiplayer server outages. First impressions are everything, and the game's first impressions were the reason why the game was received so poorly. Most of those issues started clearing up, so did the criticisms, and it was you started to get a clearer picture and understanding of what Andromeda did well and not so well. So the main thing here, first of all, is that in the single player, there were concerns that I had going into the game. Like, I had just come off of doing tests for a game like Ghost Recon Wildlands, which I still for some reason find myself playing when I'm bored, just because the game is a good boredom killer. It's not what I would consider to be a particularly good game. There's just things to do. It's just a game of things. Nothing particular. There's nothing particular that stands out about it. One of the things that did stand out about it that drove me crazy and still does is the cover system. The cover system in that game is horrible. It is so bad. You'll stick to cover when you don't want to. You'll find yourself not being able to get into cover when you want to. You'll be finding yourself facing the wrong way in cover, and it doesn't feel really intuitive getting yourself flipped around. It's just all kinds of wonky. And that was something that was a big concern for me coming into Andromeda when I saw that it was going to have that soft cover type system where you don't really, like in Mass Effect 3 or previous, you actually hit the A button to lock yourself into cover, and you actually were stuck there until you hit A to remove yourself or something to that effect, or used like a power like biotic charge to move yourself out. Now the thing is that was one of the biggest concerns I had. There were other people that were kind of pointing out some, like, picking apart trailers and stuff, like as in the thumbnail here that we see, the joke of PB when you first meet her. She kind of does this thing where she's like pulls up a gun to shoot a remnant that's behind you, and she's clearly holding the gun backwards. Like, they completely misanimated that. That was something that was it was so bad. Someone picked that out of a frame out of a trailer that was showing, and was like, "Oh, see, the game's gonna be bad. Look at this thing here." And I was just like, that's not really demonstrating that it's gonna be like this horrible thing. I mean, yeah, that definitely looks silly and it's definitely comical, but in hindsight, yes, that was demonstrative of of animation woes that the game had ended up happening. But the thing is what I really came into it was that there was a lot of things that I knew were going to be good just from playing Dragon Age Inquisition. The level design in both Andromeda and Dragon Age Inquisition are actually extremely well done. They're probably the highlight of the game. Their level designers are top notch, and when you're making an open world open world game, you have to have well-made, crafted levels, and they do that. And I mean, albeit there's some things, I'm pretty certain that the first planet you go to, that there's a little bit of asset reuse. Whenever you see that like spiraling stuff in the sky, it looks exactly like a color swapped version of the breach from Inquisition. And I made the joke, of course, shared universe confirmed. You know, that's the other side of the breach, right? That's where it leads to. It didn't lead to the Fade. It led to that planet in the middle of it, the Andromeda galaxy. Har har har, because I'm so witty. And Havarl was one of my favorite planets as far as design goes, but that's not shocking because it was one of the smallest. It was, when you have a smaller map, you can cram more detail into it without overloading hardware. Like when you're programming, even for high-end computers, the more stuff that you put into that map, the more physics and particle effects and things that might be moving, like leaves and stuff, those all take a little bit extra tax off of the hardware of the system you're running it on. So the fact that it was a smaller map, they were able to cram in so much more detail into it. That's one of the reasons why I feel like Havarl was kind of one of the prettiest ones in the game. That, and it had this really cool nightscape to it. As poor as the map was, I kind of felt like in a similar way the Hissing Wastes from Dragon Age Inquisition was also a really cool nightscape map. Unfortunately, that map was so horrible to get through because it was so big. It was so big, but it had such a great landscape to it. The problem is that you're just traveling so slow. It just took you forever to transition across that map. So, but like after praising the map design, that's really the most of what I can really say that's good about it. The game looks, and I would say just in general, the game looks good. It's got a very nice polish and sheen to it that is pretty much indicative of most AAA games nowadays. And the combat isn't too bad, but I'll touch on that. But that's really about where it ends. See, Mass Effect Andromeda is, at its heart, an RPG. It's what BioWare is known for. It's not an action-adventure game like if you were to say, you know, the Lord of the Rings games like Shadow of Mordor, right? That's an action-adventure game. There are some story points to it, but the main draw of that is having a already really fleshed out character that's already done. You don't really make any choices with him. You just ride along for the ride. You experience a story that he's a part of, and then you kill some enemies. You beat up some guys. Batman Arkham games are the same way. God of War games are the same way. There's dozens of these games that are of that similar vein, where they're just open world or open-ish world action-adventure games. And I think Batman Arkham games are some of the best ones out there, despite me not particularly liking WB. Those games are actually pretty well done. The open worlds feel good in those games. Even Shadow of Mordor. I didn't play Shadow of War because I wasn't too keen on their model that they had for it. So anyway, but that's really where most of that was one component that really, being an action adventure game is not something that Mass Effect is really pushed as, and it's not really something that I think is really particularly what you should be focusing on when you're making a game like this. Unfortunately, that's kind of where I think they went. Like, they essentially took a lot of the story elements of Mass Effect 2 and then kind of said, hey, we're going to kind of paste this over a more action-adventure-y type system. And I feel like it really hurt it. Now, a lot of people may ask, why is that a bad thing? Mass Effect 2 was arguably the best Mass Effect game out there. It was one of the best ever made. It had such a great story to it. Except, honestly, they didn't really do it so well. One of the big hitches that I talk to people about is that in the very beginning of the game, this really isn't a spoiler because this literally happens in the first freaking 5 minutes. If you're spoiled by a game that's been out for a year and isn't really that good, sorry, but spoiler alert nonetheless. Alec Ryder dies. Sorry, it happened. The thing is that Alec Ryder is built up to be a very significant character, like someone who has a lot of history and feels really good. Except then the problem is that he dies too quickly for his character to really be developed. And I feel like that is something that really hurt the story overall in the game, was the fact that he was killed off. The reason why it kind of has that symbolism to Mass Effect 2 is because, like, in the very beginning of Mass Effect 2, Shepard gets killed. The difference is that Shepard's death has a huge impact to it because you've already spent an entire game playing as Shepard, and it felt like whenever he died, you were just like, what? Like this jaw drop moment, it hit you hard. This was a guy that you had assumingly played an entire game as, had come to kind of understand. You kind of had related to him because you had expressed yourself through him, so you had kind of grown this emotional attachment to him, and then bam, they sucker punch you. He doesn't just die, he dies in an extremely lonely way. He suffocates out in the middle of space all alone. Like, that shit kills it. In Andromeda, instead, he died saving his son, which, that's cool. But his death felt hollow. Like, I didn't really have any attachment to him. That's obviously my personal opinion. Other people may have felt that attachment to him. And having played through the game and the secrets you learn about your father, you kind of get more to it. But it's still like that death, that whole moment of death felt a little bit more hollow as a result. So that was one big thing. The second thing is that Mass Effect 2 had some of the most amazing character cast for side characters in it. That's really where BioWare kind of had their storytelling established as telling the story through your through the side characters, and instead of through a main narrative. Their primary way of telling the story was, hey, we're going to tell a story through the side characters. And I can imagine a lot of people were like, what? That makes no sense. How do you tell a story through side characters? Except it actually worked very well. It was actually exceptionally well done. All of the side characters in that game were literally considered to be the best part of the damn game. It was just so well done. All the characters were fleshed out, and here's the thing is, nearly all of them were new characters to that game. So a lot of the people that were like, oh, you can't compare it to Mass Effect 2 because Mass Effect 2 had a whole game developed before it, that got a head start on everything. Except a lot of the characters didn't. They were starting off from scratch. You were introduced to them, and every one of them kind of had this like really well drawn out side quest story that, like, not all of them were amazing, but they still felt good. But instead, what Andromeda felt like it had was, it really felt like it had companions that were essentially transposed from your first set of characters from Mass Effect 1. Essentially, to start off with, you had 2 human companions. You had one that was kind of more of the how did I term it here? You had the more emotionally conservative and the emotionally radical character, right? So in the first game, that was Caden. Caden Caden was the emotionally conservative one. He was more by the book unless you really dug into him, and then you got more of his emotional things. He kind of kept himself guarded a bit, whereas Ashley was a much more upfront with her feelings, was much more in your face about a lot of things. Well, in Andromeda, we had that same thing, but it was kind of actually reversed. So you actually had, and it's not exactly this, but sort of, you had the same thing, but gender swapped. So you had Cora, who was your emotionally conservative one. She kind of was business by the book. You saw a few emotional outbursts from her, but for the most part, you really had to dig into her to really figure out what she was about. Whereas you had the other guy, I can't remember his name because I prefer to ignore his existence. I'm actually trying to look through here to see. Oh, Liam. That's it. There we go. Liam was your emotionally radical one. He was in your face about how lazy he was. The unfortunate part is that there was no Vermeer to leave Liam on like there was for Caden. So anyway, then after that we had a quirky cute Asari, a little bit nerdy, has a little bit of science in her, right? She's kind of the one that's socially awkward that you get a kick out of, because she's like the one who's not very good at communicating with a lot of people and says things that are kind of unintentional innuendos that make this conversation awkward, but you kind of find that endearing. Am I talking about Liara or am I talking about PB? Both, because yes, the characters are very much different, but the archetype of the character is the same. It is the same archetype, that socially awkward, quirky, cute character that also, coincidentally, both happens to be an Asari, who both happen to be an expert on the technology. Well, not an expert, but I guess you could say someone has a wealth of knowledge on the unknown technology that you encounter in those games. In Mass Effect 1, that's encountering the Prothean technology, right? Liara is an expert scientist that has been studying Prothean technologies for decades, with teams of scientists studying it like a proper scientist. PB is an expert on remnant technology because she's been tinkering with it for a couple of months. I don't know. In any case, it's still the same concept, is that someone who tags along with you because they understand the research, the technology that you will be encountering through the game. Then you have Garrus, or I should say who is it? It was Garrus and Vetra, right? So Garrus was the very principled, by the book, like he was, or not by the book, I should say. He was the principled to a fault, very passionate CSEC officer that you run into, who ultimately values justice above everything else. He actually felt like he had a good reason to be there, because Shepard allowed him the means by which to kind of dispense justice and cut through the red tape that CSEC was burdened with, so he could actually do what he wanted without having to worry about CSEC breathing down his neck. Conversely, Vetra, female version of Garrus, because why not? We need to have a Turian on board so that all of the Garrus fans, I guess, can be fans of Vetra. Except she never felt like she had a reason to be there. She was a procurement specialist who's good at getting things. She was the Red from Shawshank Prison. She was the Red. She was the person who knew how to get things. Except her justification for coming on board is she could get things for the Tempest. Except I always felt like that kind of didn't make sense. She would be able to get things and acquire things if she was aboard the Nexus, the kind of the heart of traffic and trade. I'm assuming there was more than just one ship, because the aliens got going all these other planets. They didn't just get there magically, so there had to be other ships. Vetra would have been better at the heart of the Milky Way excursion directing things to where they need to get going. She would have been able to help the Tempest more by acquiring more goods to send them. She would have been able to help other people more. It just never made any sense. Like, her motivation from the start just never made sense why she wanted to go on the Tempest. So it kind of overall felt weak. And then we had, so now let's see. So then we had Rex and Drac. And Rex, in the first game, you find out a lot of really kind of crazy shit about him, where essentially that he was a warlord on like where he came from until his own dad betrayed him and tried to kill him, and he survived. At first, you kind of find out, like, you see him, you meet him, and he just seems like, man, he helps you take down Fist. He seems like a thug for the large part, and since Shepard gets to blow shit up, hell yeah, that's a good guy to run around with. But actually, as you dig into him, you find that the reason why Rex is actually tagging along with Shepard, you get hints of it in the first game, and then it is spelled out more explicitly in following games. But he does say in the first game afterwards is that he kind of looks up to Shepard a lot of ways how he epitomizes the Krogan's honor to be, which in the future games he essentially like shows this off as in Mass Effect 3 specifically as, you know, so many Krogans do it wrong, you know, and that's a lot of the problem is that they don't oftentimes get it. And he's one of the few that does, and he's like, look at Shepard. Shepard's how a Krogan should be, except for he's a human. But Drac, unfortunately, he felt like a badass, like legitimately. The guy's like 1,400 years old. Holy shit. And his twist, his side story is he's old as shit. His redundant organs are starting to fail because apparently he's just so badass and has been through so much shit. You're essentially trying to throw out the Thane twist of like, hey, Thane this whole time has had a terminal disease and he's dying, and that's sad. But the difference is that you grow attached to Thane before he dies, whereas Drac is just kind of like, you can't really get attached to him except for being like, hell yeah, this guy's like the grandpa I never had, and he's a badass, I guess. He just really doesn't feel like he has more than one dimension to him, and that's kind of where I felt like he was like Drax if Drax was made out of a sheet of paper. And then we had the exotic alien from Mass Effect 1, which was Tali. Tali was from the Quarian race, which are largely unknown, misunderstood. They're treated like, essentially like the Romani, right? They're gypsies. That's pretty much the stereotype they're built as in Mass Effect 1, is people don't understand them, therefore they fear them, and they treat them with a high degree of scorn. And yeah, that it's largely because they just don't understand them. They don't know. All that they know the Quarians did was the Quarians broke the AI Accords and developed a sentient race of machines. Well, you guys are a bunch of fucking assholes then. The entire race must be bad. In any case, she is the kind of exotic one, and honestly, you know, she was a highlight character, but you didn't get too much deep into her story in that game. It wasn't until future games that you really got a lot out of her. Jal, conversely, is actually probably the highlight character of Andromeda. Jal is actually great. If he is a little bit of a Fabio stereotype, to be frankly honest. Like, I was surprised that we weren't introduced to him by him riding bareback on horse with no shirt on and with long flowing hair behind him, because I felt like that's really how he's kind of spelled out, is he's like literally the male protagonist of a Harlequin romance novel. I don't know how else to spell that out, but that regardless, even if he was kind of that stereotype, he still had a lot of depth and was an interesting character, and he actually made sense. He was like your liaison to the Angaran people. Well, that shit was pretty cool. That's nice. That was actually a good character. Everybody else felt just completely out of place. and felt so one-dimensional and just felt like they were copied from the original crew of Mass Effect 1. And that's kind of the divide I dropped there. But, and as I was saying, why do I talk about companions so much? And that's largely because if you compare from HK-47 to Kang the Mad to Morton Solus, BioWare has built their brand on telling stories through companions of the game. That's how you fill out the world. And that's largely one of the things that I noticed that that's drawn people in. If you talk to anybody about a BioWare game, they'll tell you how much they love this character or that character. Be it talk to someone about Cullen from Dragon Age, or talk to someone about Anders or Morgan, or name your characters from Dragon Age. People have strong opinions about them, right? Talk to them about Mass Effect. Mention Garrus, mention Tali, Liara, like all of these characters, Jack. People will have strong opinions on these characters, and that's kind of one of the things that really tends to stratify their brand, is people are so connected to these characters that are in the game. And I feel like that is really where Andromeda fell short, is the side characters are so weak. I've been often critical of their antagonists, because let's be honest, you had Mass Effect 2. What was the antagonist of that game? I think I put it Harbinger Possessed Collector number 212. That's the antagonist of the game. Yeah, it's supposed to be Harbinger, but he never really feels like he's an imposing threat of any kind. The Harbinger, the collectors themselves never feel like they're any real opposing threat to Shepard as a character. It just feels like they're a mild inconvenience for Shepard, that he mows them down while he's trying to figure out what they're doing to other people. In a good story, and any author will be able to corroborate this with me, in a good story, the antagonist is supposed to be a foil to the protagonist. They are the means by which the protagonist defines themselves, right? So when you have this amalgamous, like gray, nebulous antagonist that doesn't really in any way pose a threat, either emotionally or physically, to the protagonist, it really never feels like they're there. There's nothing that really defines the protagonist, which is, I guess, it worked out because the side characters were so good. They acted almost in the role of the antagonist by helping the protagonist define himself, by them doing stuff, by their turmoils, by the things that they go through. Like all of their side quests, you had antagonists, you had good, compelling stories to tell there. And it was just like Shepard was the co-pilot for all of his companions' stories in that game. And that was how he defined himself, but he himself never really had something unto himself. And that's one of the reasons why I say that Mass Effect 2 was actually not that good of a story. People remember it much more fondly than it actually was, I think, a lot of times. They have the nostalgia goggles, as I like to call them. And Dragon Age Inquisition, just as bad in the original game. Now, they fixed it a lot with the final DLC, the Trespasser DLC, but Coryphish, or Corypheus, I can't call him Corypheus, I call him Coryphish because I have that little fucking respect for him, was such a bad antagonist. Now, without spoiling that story, because I feel like it's such a great story if you haven't played it, to get to Trespasser, there's a lot more going on there that actually does have some really compelling antagonist action going on. But Corypheus was such a bland, like, I'm a bad guy because I'm a bad guy. Like, his motivation felt like absolutely nothing. Like, there was no real motivation to him. He didn't feel like he was real in any sense. And I'm a very tough judge on antagonists in any story, be it a movie, be it whatever. one of the things I love most is I love whenever an antagonist wins. It's one of the reasons why I say the Captain America Civil War was actually a lot better movie than a lot of people think, and that's largely because the antagonist, Baron Zemo, won in the end. His goal was to dismantle the Avengers, to break them apart from the inside. And a lot of people were like, oh, he wasn't like the original Baron Zemo. I'm like, yes, they did not translate Baron Zemo from the comics very well into the movie. He felt like he was a lot less than he could have been. And now he didn't die, so maybe he will be later. But regardless, he still felt like he had a good motivation of someone who is a very dangerous individual. And I don't mean that necessarily physically. He's dangerous in the sense that he is very smart. And he dismantled him. He won. There was several people that ended up, bad guys that end up winning in the end. Like, for example, Kaiser Soze, the Infinite Kaiser Soze. He won in the end. He got away with everything, right? That's a good antagonist to me. Is someone who, not only do you see them as potentially winning, sometimes you find yourself even rooting for them to win, right? How often did, when someone was watching Captain America Civil War, did you find yourself rooting for one particular side of the Avengers versus the other? Captain America versus Iron Man. Did you find yourself rooting for one of them? Guess what? You were rooting for the bad guy to win. Blow your mind there. Aside from that, that was something that I felt like that Andromeda also did extremely poorly. Their antagonist was so bad. The Archon, I felt like, had no depth or dimension, was never established in any meaningful way. He felt like he was essentially the Corypheus of Andromeda. He might as well be the same. I'm a bad guy because I'm a bad guy. Why, when a real life person goes conquering, right? There is always some kind of subtlety that you can derive behind their conquering. With another spoiler for Andromeda here, when you are a race of people that is built from genetically modifying other races, right? You're essentially kind of almost you can see him as being an evil version of the Saurian in some ways, right? But what is driving their need to conquer, to go out and actually conquer other races? What is the divide? Are they running out of resources on their planet? Are they, do they have some other force that's chasing them? There's a lot of questions that could be behind the scenes that would help define them as an antagonizing force. What is their motivation? Right now it just looks like we like shooting things and stuff. There's no motivation there. And that's one of the weakest parts of it, is that Archon just seems like a very faceless and bland leader that you don't even get to fight in the end, mind you. You just fight a few swarms of generic bad guys and then someone else takes out Archon. It's like the most anticlimactic and weak ending of a game ever. But it was always going to be that way because the antagonist was weak as fuck. That is honestly, dealing with the internal politics of the Nexus was more challenging than the Archon was. And then we had the conversations. Yeah, so one thing I will say that I love-hate on is the binary morality systems. I've wrote other blog posts about how I despise binary morality, good versus evil. Real life, no matter how much politics will try to tell you this, real life is not good versus evil, black versus white, so on and so forth. In everything in life is in a varying shade of gray. Like everything, there is almost never an occasion where you will find something completely on one extreme, 100% or 0%. You will find everything is a percentage point or fractions of a percent in between there. So whenever you have the choice of dark side versus light side, or the what was it, you had Paragon versus Renegade, open palm versus closed fist, so on and so forth. BioWare has loved their binary morality systems. The catch on there is that I prefer something with, if you're going to do a role-playing story and you want to have some sort of morality, I do like the classic D&D system of having the lawful versus chaotic and the good versus evil. And just because a lot of that, I feel like you can get a lot more definition to your characters. The catch is that is obnoxiously difficult to implement with branching conversation trees, right? If you have to have 9 goddamn choices or something akin, at least say 3 choices in a given conversation, because maybe you don't have a lawful or a lawful neutral or a chaotic good conversation choice, but maybe you have a chaotic choice here, or a good choice there, or a lawful choice here, or so on and so forth, where essentially you're kind of breaking it up into choices that are of different moral compasses. But unfortunately enough, BioWare seems to be kind of getting away from that, which I think is for the best. If they actually did this thing right. So they tried to take the Dragon Age 2 approach of having the different emotional responses, right? Where you'd have like sarcastic and tearful and like emotional, logical, and so on. I can't remember what all the choices were that you were given. I just know that they were snarky, and obviously snarky is always the best answer to give. The problem is that you didn't actually get a full gamut of options very often. Most of the time you were given the choice between emotional or logical. That was it. 2 choices. Like, okay, you're talking even more binary choices than the previous Mass Effect games that had an actual binary morality system. What's even worse is that there was a few occasions where I ran into conversation choices that were literally emotional or logical, and the choices were the fucking same. Do I want a sandwich? Or do I want a sandwich? Who fucking wrote that shit? That is absolute garbage. Like, that is... I've seen rookie games with better writing than that. And that's a theme that kind of goes throughout the entire thing. That's the conversation. And a lot of the conversations in general, the side conversations with your companions, feel so janky, so amateur. Really amateur, to be frankly honest. Be it from Liam talking like a fucking kid, like, huh, he looks upset, probably because I shot him in the face. So bad. And then there's literally the jokes of Cora talking about being an Asari Huntress that literally became a meme because she mentioned Asari Huntress so many goddamn times. The main problem with the Asari Huntress bit was that previously Asari Huntress was a multiplayer character in Mass Effect 3 that was essentially an Asari, specifically an Asari infiltrator, so that had tactical cloak, that also had Dark Channel or whatever. So you see it as like a biotic infiltrator, right? But Andromeda essentially reclassified Asari Huntresses as being another name, the internal name for Asari Commandos. And I was like, oh, okay, so you're rewriting the lore. Well, they kind of rewrote it. I think there might have been some obscure mention of that. But you're essentially throwing out an obscure part of the lore into players' faces without much explanation, and it largely confused players. And she mentioned it so many damn times. It was just felt really awkward. But yeah, so the combination of those made Andromeda feel like fan fiction. And that's the truth of it, is that the writing in general, the plot, the story options, the conversation, the characters all make the game feel like it's just fan fiction. not even a real game that was developed as a unique item. It felt like they took patchwork story elements from previous games, and then they just put them all together and made sure you got all the stuff that you liked from past games. But that wasn't even the worst part. So the multiplayer on here, and I'm going to highlight a couple of major portions. The main portion of the multiplayer that really bugged me is, so first of all, when I first started playing Mass Effect 3, it's largely what founded the Pixel Crashers, you know, and in its inception was all started as a result of Mass Effect 3's multiplayer. And Mass Effect 3's multiplayer, the progression of that game is entirely based around loot boxes. You know, that thing that everybody got upset about with Battlefront 2? Apparently it was okay back in that day. None of us thought about it. There was a couple of reasons why. Is that, first of all, people were okay with it generally because at that time, just in general, loot boxes weren't considered as dark and evil of a thing as they are today. But also, and more importantly, it was because the degree of progression felt fair for the most amount of time that most people would end up playing the game. And what I mean by that is probably about, I would say 80% of the progression in that game felt pretty fair, pretty quick, and not something that really felt tedious so much. Like, you felt like you were getting upgrades, you were getting stuff pretty quickly, and everything felt nice. And it had a large burgeoning community, and most importantly, the developers, BioWare, were actively engaged with the community. And I don't mean hosting Twitch streams every week and talking at people and trying to evasively answer questions. Like, you can't tell me that shit isn't just a bunch of bullshit. Like, you get people asking you direct questions that you know you can't answer, so you have to be evasive, which kind of defeats the point of you even being on the stream. If you're going to do Q&A, yeah. If you want to see how to do a proper Q&A with the community, instead of doing the whole, we're going to play some multiplayer matches with people while we evasively dodge questions, instead, the better way to do it would be more like Digital Extremes does with Warframe, where, yes, they have streams where they sit down and play games with the community, but the actual dev Q&A, they sit down with the developers, or the development leads, the creative director, the art director, the sound director, and so on, and those folks actually sit and answer questions and talk about the direction they're going to go with the game. There's a reason why Warframe is so fucking big to this day. It's because of how they handle the community interaction. It's something that BioWare has always struggled with, but recently, and I say recently as in within the last 5 years, has largely tanked through the floor. So back whenever Mass Effect 3 was in its heyday, the development was extremely community focused. You had like weekly balance changes. There was all kinds of goodness going on, people talking about ideas, and most importantly, massive content drops. You had dozens of characters getting released this week or this month. A couple months later, you got tons more. You got maps, everything, all the time. Whenever you have a repetitive, what I like to call a looter shooter, which is largely what a lot of these games are, it's repetitively running a similar mission over and over again, hoping to get loot or get currency to buy loot, whatever you want to call it. The bread and butter of those games is variety. You have to have a lot of content variety in order to keep players from getting bored and getting content exhaustion, or getting player exhaustion from just playing the same thing over and over again. That is not what Mass Effect Andromeda, or for that matter, what Dragon Age Inquisition did. Dragon Age Inquisition started off dropping the ball hardcore with their multiplayer interaction, because they essentially were like, yay, we released the game, cool, everybody likes it, nice. Hey, we're going to release this Destruction DLC, and then we're all going to go on holiday for a month and a half. Peace. And the Destruction DLC, by the way, that's I think naming a DLC Destruction is probably very much akin to naming a cat Loki. Don't do it. Don't name a cat Loki. Don't name a DLC Destruction, because they're gonna live up to their name. I'm just my guess there. But that's what it did. It was broken. It had fundamentally broke stuff where essentially you couldn't progress through multiplayer levels. You would have to reload them. Well, they came back and they had their multiplayer audience tanked so badly. And it was the actions of one singular individual, Luke Barrett, who actually fucking carried Dragon Age Inquisition to at least reclaim at least a large portion of that multiplayer audience that they lost through his community interaction. He was there talking, him and a few other of the post-launch support team were there actively engaging and talking with people and being people, right? Not treating their audience as if they're some distant thing that you have to keep yourself away from. No, they engaged with them on a personal level, like, hey, we're both people, here's some mutual respect. Andromeda, instead, like I said, they would host weekly streams where they would avoid answering any real questions, or if they did, they would use corporatized buzzwords like we wouldn't know what the fuck they meant, and it just felt so disconnected, disjointed. Secondly, on top of that, they trickled out content at a very slow pace. It felt like Dragon Age Inquisition all over again, that supposedly had a lot smaller team supporting it, yet somehow it was the same thing. Hell, I think that Dragon Age Inquisition had more content out than Andromeda did, which is baffling. How the fuck do you get more content out with a smaller team? In any case, on top of that, you had probably the most arguably horrible thing. Oh, like when the first game first came out, there were some significant problems, and I'll touch on those before I go on to the major point. The major problems were at first, the first probably week and a half or so, you could barely finish a match. The servers were going down constantly. They could not handle any load, which almost felt like poetic justice in a certain regard, because BioWare had canceled the multiplayer beta test that they had planned for, I think, consoles only, but they still canceled it. And so when they released the multiplayer, oh, it's broken and you can't load in. It almost felt like, well, it almost seems like you guys knew that shit was broken, and instead of potentially losing those precious pre-orders, you decided to cancel it to obfuscate anybody letting that out. That's a little conspiratorial of me. I don't necessarily think that's true, but it's certainly possible, right? And that's something that I'm kind of a little weird on. But then continuing on from that, then in general, the game balance felt really off. Like, it felt really meat grindery. And what I mean by that is the time to kill, or TTK, was extremely high. Like, you would have to, it felt like you had to shoot enemies for 5,500 hours before you would actually land a kill. And it made every match feel so tedious and dry and boring. It was so bad. So bad. Now, to their credit, and later updates, they patched things and they actually drastically increased the amount of damage that weapons did, and that powers did as well, because everything felt really weak. But to be honest with you, I still think that it would have been easier to lower the health of enemies rather than raise the damage of everything else, but whatever. 6 of one, half done as the other. And even to this day, in fact, yesterday, they even released a patch that increased damage of many things even further. So they were still increasing the damage of stuff to kind of give that feeling of better player power as they're doing stuff. Like, weaker enemies should go down pretty easily, but the boss enemies, they should feel pretty strong, right? That was kind of the general idea of that. But then came patch 1.09. And let's scroll down there. So, for those not acquainted with this horrendous excuse of profiteering, patch 1.09 added weapon variations and veteran ranks into the game. And when I mean weapon variations, I mean they're actually called augments. And what these were is 3 new variations on a weapon that each added a generic power, like an ammo power, like it would do this effect, or this effect. And those 3 generic effects were copied for each weapon. Now, instead of being like an evolution choice, like for example in Mass Effect 3, where you had a power and you could choose to either go route A or route B and have different effects happen, or like in Mass Effect 3 where you had ammo powers or attachments onto weapons that would change the effects of things sometimes. Instead, these were actually positioned in the game as entirely new weapons. So you had the Avenger, you had the Avenger Augment A, Avenger Augment B, and Avenger Augment C, all in the drop table at the same time. They weren't 3 different weapons. They then later patched it, I think, where you wouldn't start getting the augment drops until after you had maxed out the original weapon. But that wasn't like for all weapons. So, for example, I did not have to have all weapons maxed out at rank 10 before I started getting augments. No, instead, I just had to have the Avenger maxed out at 10 before I started getting the Avenger augment. So it was per weapon. Then the veteran ranks, all that essentially did was, once your character dropped from a loot box 10 times, you then could get him dropped 10 more times, and then you would get a little passive bonuses to his health and shields and power damage and all that stuff for 10 more drops. So for all the characters, they now were in loot boxes twice as long, because the way that Mass Effect did it is they had a terminating loot drop system. So essentially, as you got a character to rank 10 or got a weapon to rank 10, they would be nixed out of the drop table, so you would no longer get drops of those items anymore. So as you increased in your progression, increased in the game, you would start eliminating groups of items out of the game, and you would no longer get drops of those, and then you would get drops of hopefully the things you want. So statistically, you would end up getting closer to what, like that one true thing you wanted. Well, what this did was this essentially doubled the amount of drops for character cards. Instead of being 10, there's now 20, and it quadrupled the amount of drops for weapons. Instead of being 10 drops for weapons, there were now 40 drops for weapons. There is no way that you're going to position that to me. And literally the words of BioWare, when on their live stream of them announcing it, I'm like, so wait, what is this? And their response was, well, this is extending the progression. Or something to that effect. I'm trying to remember what their exact terminology was. Yeah, extending the progression. Essentially, it's we need to juice you for more money, so we need to have more drops in those loot boxes to hopefully get more frustration purchases out of the perfectionists who want to unlock everything. That's really what it is. Now, that was also on top of the fact that all of the common tier weapons, like the Avenger and the Scorpion and the... I can't even remember them because I use them so little. All the 5 original base weapons, they also added in those same weapons a second time on a gold tier. So they're more powerful versions of their common tier original ones. So instead of being the common 5, you also had the S variants, which were rare level, and they were much more powerful than the originals. Those were a separate set of weapons, mind you. Separate set of drops. Oh, and by the way, they also had augments to them as well. So that was, instead of being 10 weapons with 10 drops, all their augments, that's 40 drops. Oh, but now you have 10 more weapons, and now you have all their augments as well. So, quick math here, 5 weapons, 10 drops. I'm so bad at math right now. I'm so tired, I'm not going to try to do that unless I think of it afterwards after I'm talking. But let's just say that way, that just that move alone drastically increased the drops out of a loot crate without actually adding anything new to the game. If you actually look at the actual unique content that has been added to that game, there has been very little added. Very little added, less than Dragon Age Inquisition, and not even fucking close to the amount of content that was added to Mass Effect 3. Mass Effect 3, within the first 6 months, we had, like, I want to say it was like some crazy, like, 24 characters or something that were added to the game. I had all the numbers figured out. Oh, actually, I do have all the numbers right here. So during the same time period, BioWare released 28 new weapons and characters for Mass Effect 3 compared to the 13 new weapons and characters to Mass Effect Andromeda. Yeah, and this is where I get into the math, and I'll actually outline the specific math on here is, for the 28 new weapons and characters, it totaled 172 drops from a loot box that you would need to max out all of those items. With the 13 new weapons in Mass Effect Andromeda, it totals 540 drops. 172 versus 540 drops. There is literally no fucking way a person can justify this as anything else but profiteering. This is the inherent flaw, and this move is what kind of opened my eyes to really how bad loot box culture is in game development, right? I was a little bit annoyed with how it was implemented in Inquisition. Excuse me. Because my main problem with Inquisition is that you did not have a terminating drop system. You would get duplicates instead. So I was annoyed by that, but I was just kind of like, grumble. Andromeda was what largely made me say, whoa, this is pretty fucking predatory. That move alone is what turned me onto the path of going towards consumer advocacy, was seeing how bad this system was and how disgusting this practice was and how it really ultimately was screwing up game design. A good multiplayer system like that does a similar model, like for example Warframe, you talk to the Warframe developers and they will tell you the way in which they earn their money is with new content. They have to constantly be churning out new weapons, new warframes, new maps, new this, new that. New content is what drives their sales. It is to the point where they sometimes have difficulty balancing player demand to fix old systems or rebalance old systems. So they kind of have to have one team of developers working on redoing or tweaking or rebalancing or whatever older things, and then one team that is focused entirely on creating the next new thing. And it's kind of a juggling act. But they know the way they make their money is through new content, churning through new content. This is not new content. This is called taking the current content you have and trying to profiteer off of it. You're just trying to exploit your audience through forcing them to get more loot boxes. The reason why, and you can go back and watch my loot box video if you want to talk more about the mental impact of how loot boxes work. The more loot boxes you have to open, the more friendly to them you become, right? The more likely you are to purchase one with real money. The more likely you are to become addicted if you have a predisposition to gambling addictions. That's the reason why I chided them on Twitter whenever they're like, hey, come get a new a loot box gift for our anniversary. I'm like, yeah, I know someone who I've met a person once that also gave out addictive substances for their birthday parties. He was a drug dealer. Yeah, that's exactly what that is. The free loot box they're trying to get you, it's not because they're trying to be fucking nice. It's because they're trying to get you hooked. That is how disgusting I was in it. But yeah, and then I go on to talk about the negative impacts of loot boxes mentally, which if you want to hear about those, that's all in my loot box video. You guys can go back and watch that. That outlines it much more. I should say both loot box videos, because I actually kind of clarified it on the next episode after that. I'm not going to go through that here, but yeah, they're bad. Anyway, so I did go on to say, yes, I understand BioWare is trying to make money. There's a difference between wanting to make money and wanting to make money and skirting ethical complications here. There are ethical ways, there are good ways, positive ways that you can go about making money, even having loot boxes. Like, loot boxes, I'm not against loot boxes in general. It's the manner in which they're currently handled that I have the major problem with. It's just the fact that they're so unethical as it is. So if you want to handle loot box, and I outline this also in my loot box video, where, you know, if you want to handle things ethically, hey, it's pretty simple. Just disclose your drop rates. Let people know, hey, there's gambling in the game. It is gambling. And that's not a debate. It is fucking gambling. And then just say, hey, by the way, gambling can be addictive. If you are concerned about this, hey, here's a link to a place to get some help. That's all. That's the way you handle things ethically. But that's not how they're handled here. The reason why they want to obfuscate as much of it as possible so that they can hopefully trick more people into getting involved in their gambling scam. But I also suggested that, hey, you know what would be really nice, given their model systems and how potentially profitable these are, it would be actually, to me, smart if BioWare spun off the Dragon Age and Mass Effect multiplayer components into standalone free-to-play games. Like, just straight. And then have long-term development cycles behind them, rather than, you know, being tied to each new Mass Effect or Dragon Age game. Instead, have a free-to-play Dragon Age game that you continually add content to for like 5+ years, right? Or a multiplayer for Mass Effect that you continually add content to for 5+ years. New maps, new weapons, new characters. You do Warframe, but Dragon Age version of Warframe or Mass Effect's version of Warframe. That would be insanely profitable. Granted, you do the loot boxes ethically. That would be insanely profitable. You'd be doing the right thing by your players. The players who want to play that sort of game, want to play the looter shooter, would have a game to play. And then you could focus your development team on story-driven content for the single player. Seems too logical. That's probably why it's not done. Alright, so I'm going to try to wrap up this last bit here within the next 10 minutes or so. The last part was the community. And this is this is where things kind of get unpleasant. And this is unfortunate this season even has to be a conversation. I've gone over this in some form or another in previous videos, like talking about how to be not to be a fanboy, essentially. A lot of the problem with BioWare games, the best part and the worst part, all wrapped in one, is the community. BioWare games have some of the most passionate players you will come across, like more so than Overwatch, more so than so many other games that I've encountered. BioWare has an extremely passionate fan base. Passionate has its own detriment, though. Because they're so passionate, they are so emotionally involved in the game, they are very prone to being really toxic. That's part of the reason why the BSN forums were shut down, is because while the BSN forums were the best way for BioWare to communicate with their player base, and it was proven because they have sucked at communicating with their player base since then, at the same time, they're largely the reasoning behind that is that it was so toxic to be there. People were so emotionally invested in it. So that's largely the upside and the downside. There is a fringe element, and when I say fringe, I mean it is the very small minority of players. The majority of BioWare fans, or people who even just mildly enjoy BioWare games, are very mild. They're very pleasant to deal with. They're very amicable. They can have an intelligent discussion just fine. There's a fringe, a very small element of that fan base that is very sinister and very vitriolic. And they're not necessarily negative or positive for Andromeda. In Andromeda's case, personally, you had some that were like just bellowing out about, here are the secret conspiracies behind why certain design choices happened in Andromeda, which I chalked up to Hanlon's Razor. Never credit malice for what is essentially probably stupidity and poor game design, poor project management. That's the truth of it. As we found out later on, a lot of the bad choices in the game weren't from some nefarious plot by SJWs. It was largely just because the project was handled like shit. That's the truth. And then you have people on the other side, the fanatics that were on the other side, that Andromeda is the perfect game. And the only people who say otherwise are haters, right? They're haters. I thought Andromeda was a painfully average game. But to these fringe groups, there is no such thing as average. They are very hyperbolic. You either love the game or hate the game. If you know the negative, the anti-Andromeda crowd, if you don't hate the game, specifically if you don't hate the game, you are the main problem with gaming nowadays. You are the reason for all of the problems with gaming nowadays. For the pro Andromeda crowd, if you don't love the game, you are the reason for all the problems in gaming nowadays. See how that works? They're the same person, if you will, the same position. The only difference is it love or is it hate? It might as well be the same damn thing. They're both just as vitriolic. They both hold the exact same position. It's either my way or you're the most evil person alive. They switch up language a little bit depending on, is it anti-just SJW, or are you a racist, misogynist, homophobe, transphobe, most disgusting person on the face of the planet. Take your pick. They'll switch up language a little bit, but the end result is the same. And these fringe elements became so deafening in the course of Andromeda leading up to its release, and after its release it became so difficult to get any real criticism heard, because you had so many people that were talking about, look at all of this really bad stuff in the game. Look at how the female characters were designed in this game. This was obviously an SJW agenda. Here, let me point to Manveer Air, who is obviously a racist, who I'm pretty certain got fired from BioWare. And then you had that one lady that said that she was you could rape people in GTA 5, that was also working for BioWare in some capacity, and therefore everything in BioWare has to be an SJW agenda. And I'm like, you're a moron. And then you had other people that were like, oh, everything in BioWare is great. Look how, all these people, don't listen to the haters. Just buy the game and see for yourself. Don't ask questions. Just buy the game and see for yourself. Which, as a consumer advocate, that is the worst advice I have ever fucking heard. Don't just buy something, especially whenever the return policy, it might be a little bit suspect, especially with digital distribution, where sometimes it's difficult to return digital items. Especially I think on Xbox and PlayStation 4, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think as of right now, as of March 21st, 2018, that they do not have very clear return policies for digital games that you might purchase. If you bought the physical game, that's a little bit easier. But yeah, so no, both were equally as bad. And a lot of that, then the worst part about it, and I previously critiqued another video of this person. I said I wasn't going to talk about it at that time, but I'm going to outline it here. One of the worst parts about this whole experience was watching the YouTube and Twitch influencers, which there was actually a Game Changers program that BioWare ran, where they essentially flew out a group of prominent BioWare content creators to all the different BioWare studios. They even got to do a little bit of beta testing for the multiplayer, very isolated. They didn't get to see a whole lot. And really, after the game launched, you really got to see the true moral character of a lot of those content creators, where some of them denied anything negative about the game, despite avid evidence in the game. Some of them who actually were like, this is actually really bad, and they outright admitted it. They were just like, this is bad, this is garbage, and you could tell those people were the honest ones. Then you had some that actually went and attacked critics, and one of them was Mass Effect follower, who's now known as BioWare follower. Actually, I think there's multiple people that work on that channel, but specifically it was Tucker from BioWare follower, who I did do a critique, a rebuttal of a video that he did with I think it was someone else I can't remember the name of. I apologize in advance for not remembering that other person's name, but he was the main focus because I felt like he was the person that was mainly perpetrating the misinformation. And I'm not going to talk about, like, we actually discussed these comments, he and I, and came to an understanding. So keep in mind that what I'm saying here is not necessarily the views that Tucker holds right now, okay? Tucker may have changed his mind, and as I said, just because he changed his mind, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's a bad person. That actually means he might be a smart person. So the comments that I'm about to share are dated. They were made shortly after the game was released and do not necessarily reflect his views today. So big disclaimer there. Now, the reviews are people's opinions and nothing but that. That should not deter you from trying out the game and seeing if you enjoy it yourself. Some people are not a fan of RPGs or open world games, and from there they're not going to like Mass Effect Andromeda, and therefore they're going to write negative things about the game. Plus, as many of you know from being on the internet, some people just like to cause negative feedback. They just want to say bad things about a game just to fuel hate. Try to ignore them if you can. So essentially he says that you should just pretty much ignore negative reviews. Because either they don't like RPGs, open world games, or they're just trying to promote hate. Another quote he said was, "All the story missions I played have all felt well written and set up. The side missions I've done are widely varying in what you have to do, and they feel like they have a meaning. The random characters I come across feel alive and like they have a purpose of being there." That can't be someone who actually played the fucking game. I'm serious. All the missions have all felt written and well set up. Really? Because most of them actually did not feel well written or set up. How about that last mission of the game that ended with just kind of a fizzle, like didn't feel really well written at all? The side missions I've done are widely varying in what you have to do, and they feel like they all have meaning. They're fucking fetch quests. Generic fetch quests that are designed to fill out open worlds to make them feel like they're not bland, empty open worlds, right? Like I said, the level design is beautiful, but they're big, empty worlds, which is something that BioWare seems to have a problem with. They don't know how to fill out open worlds very well in a way that feels meaningful. The random characters you come across feel alive and like they have a purpose for being there. 99% of the side characters and pretty much all the Mass Effect Andromeda games feel like they are just robots. They aren't actually even there. It's only about maybe 10% of them you actually hear dialogue from and feel interesting, and then of those 10%, probably about 10% of those, so 1% of the characters in the game you actually have meaningful interaction with, which that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the random characters you come across don't necessarily feel alive or have a purpose for being there. And what I said was, I feel like that felt like a public statement, like a publicity statement written by BioWare themselves. On a small level, I pity channels like BioWare Follower, and like I said, this is not necessarily his position now, nor is it necessarily mine of him now. But as I've said before, is that a lot of the problem with those people that built channels, like myself, built channels on BioWare. Like, I was small. I'm still a small channel, but at the time he was significantly larger and had much more of a following, built on his dedication to Mass Effect games and now just BioWare games in general, and is going to continue that way as Anthem comes out and they turn their focus to Anthem. The problem is that he is put in this stuck position where, and I don't necessarily know this is true. I don't know what his thoughts are. Tucker will have to, answer that himself. I'm not going to answer for him. But if I was put in his position, I would myself feel like I'm kind of in a trap where essentially if I say negative things about BioWare property, BioWare game, or what have you, since I am a larger channel, the chances of BioWare hearing it are extremely high, right? Second to that, since I sometimes, like, if you're a larger channel, BioWare sometimes gives you special treatment, maybe early access to the game, maybe review copy, stuff that you can therefore use in order to get material for your videos, right, that fuel your content development. That in and of itself means that you're kind of reliant on them for access, for content. And if you say bad things about their game, you run the risk of them blacklisting you. So therefore you can't get early access or special things from that developer. Maybe special spotlighting, for example, like BioWare does for a lot of Twitch streamers. They will turn their massive streamer base, where they will be streaming for tens of thousands of viewers on Twitch, and they will host their loyal fan channels. Although some of them are a little bit more even keeled than others, like Starbuck 2190 has done a lot of Mass Effect and content in the past, and they would host her, and she definitely benefited a lot from that. Nothing bad about that. You do what you gotta do, man. That's the hustle, right? But like, her getting that perk benefit, like, might put her at odds of wanting to say something negative. On top of that, your audience expects you to be a fan of BioWare's content. So if you say negative stuff about it, your fans may leave because they want to hear someone who's saying good stuff about BioWare's content. And there's also another thing that's known as subversive advertising. It's not always done knowingly either. Manipulating people into making a purchase by saying nice things about it or featuring the game, sometimes you don't even know. That's why one of the reasons why they're called an influencer. They're essentially an advertising venue that a lot of publishers know about. That's oftentimes free, like just having that on there. Now, the thing is that whenever you accuse or you try to discredit criticism of a game, rather than making your own criticism that maybe shows it in a positive light, when you are criticizing other people's criticism, that's at what point you become suspect. So what I mean by that is, if someone criticizes, say, this video, right? So someone makes a critique of this video, and then I want to criticize their criticism. Cool. That's the way it should be done. I look at what they say, the things they say, and say, well, this is right, this is wrong, here's why, right? I don't go and say, this person shouldn't criticize me because X and X motivation of their character, they're not worthy to criticize me. That's called ad hominem and is a logical fallacy. Where the name of my thing comes from, Mortiel fallacy. Any point is that when you're criticizing other critics, as people, instead of criticizing their criticisms, that's when it becomes a problem. That's kind of where he largely dropped the ball in that case. And like I said, that's not necessarily to say that he holds those views now. I do not believe that people are static individuals and forever hold the same opinion, and he more than likely has an entirely different viewpoint. Feel free to go ask him yourself if you would like to find out his views on it. I'm sure he'd be happy to share them with you. Moving on. And the main reason why it's important for these voices to be properly and ethically minded is because not everyone has money to waste on a game they won't enjoy. So whenever a trusted voice is counting healthy consumer feedback, it undermines the trust that consumers have in those of us with any measure of public responsibility. This is utter deception perpetrated by several such influencers was, without a doubt, the most pivotal elements leading to the consumer backlash against Andromeda. The Streisand effect, as it were, because all of these influencer and people trying to say, don't pay attention to the haters, it only further amplified the negative backlash towards it. Overall, I think Andromeda was indicative of the overall state of BioWare during the development of Inquisition and Andromeda, including the upcoming Anthem. They were creatively rudderless, sailing whatever way the wind was blowing, denoting a lack of proper creative leadership and overall project vision. Now, that may have changed. BioWare Montreal was merged into EA Motive, and Aaron Flynn was replaced by Casey Hudson as GM of BioWare, essentially the top spot in the BioWare company. The only beacon of hope that Anthem won't turn out to be as bland as Inquisition/Andromeda is that Drew Karpyshyn, the main reason BioWare games are so popular, is the lead writer on the project. As I write this, the multiplayer is still currently receiving updates, but the single-player support was ended a few weeks ago. Well, now it's been many, many months ago. I imagine that Andromeda's multiplayer will continue receiving updates for months to come as they continue to unethically... I don't know what else I've been there. I need to proofread my stuff a little bit better. They continue to unethically earn money out of players through manipulative microtransactions that really should be classified as gambling. Going forward from here, there are several lessons and opportunities for BioWare. They have already made changes to their organization that they may see their content improve. I, however, will not presume that. Time will reveal that what, if any, effect those changes may create. Now, I went on to kind of talk about essentially where I was going from here with my own thing, but the lesson I learned here is that corporate greed inevitably diseases creativity. Not only has this experience made me extremely distrustful of BioWare, but AAA game development as a whole, which is honestly for the best. Businesses should not be entitled to your patronage. They should earn it, something which BioWare has seemingly forgotten. And I think that's a good point on which to kind of wrap things up here, is that I think that the problem is with BioWare's really passionate fan base who seems to just want to buy anything they churn out. I feel like that they've gotten to a position where they just felt entitled to the consumer's money. And I think that's largely the problem, is that because of the current, I guess you could say the current nature of how the consumer landscape is, where people are not encouraged to be skeptical. Uh-oh. What's going on here? Did my stream fail? Looked like it might have failed on Twitch, but I can't be sure of that. So if you are still seeing this on Twitch, I hope you are. It's possible. But in any case, I'm just going to go ahead and keep going on just in case it's on everywhere else. The main thing is that I really think that people should be more skeptical of companies, and that's currently not something that happens right now. Currently, people just buy things without asking any questions. They buy things and then try to justify it later, which honestly, as comical as that is, that was something I talked about in being a good consumer, is that people very often will buy stuff and then try to justify it afterwards rather than asking questions, researching, and so forth. And that really is what hurts things most of all, is the fact that you don't question a purchase before you make it. Hopefully at some point that will improve, if at all. The hope is that as these corporations continue to be greedy and essentially screw over their customer base with these really anti-consumer choices, that hopefully consumers become leery and start to question more. That's the hope. We'll see if that becomes a thing. But my thing is that Mass Effect Andromeda, its story and what became of it, has really what driven me to this place where I'm at now. So in a sense, I owe a little bit of gratitude to Mass Effect Andromeda's failure as kind of as creating the Mortiel Fallacy as a series and kind of shaping my content towards wanting to highlight more indie developers where it appears that the real creativity in the games industry is happening, like Divinity Original Sin 2, Senua's or Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. You know, those are games that demonstrate some amazing creativity and artwork. And then I think Kingdom Come Deliverance was also an independent game. Correct me if I'm wrong on there. But these are games that are demonstrating a lot of creativity and new directions to go in the games industry. And Warframe is also one that's been around for a while and is still leading a lot. And it's an indie game, right? That is largely the story on where my views are at with Mass Effect Andromeda and kind of why I don't make content for them anymore. So, in any case, this turned out to be longer than I wanted it to, but it's a topic about which I'm extremely verbose, so that kind of is what it is. But we're going to go ahead and get signed off here for the night. We'll be back on Saturday with a Pixel Crashers podcast for any of you guys wanting to tune in. And that will be a good time. We'll have Kev and Zyphon on there for some good old fun. And then we'll probably laugh at Kev for some inexplicable reason. But that's because of what we do. Yo. Anyway, as I sign off here for the night, one of the new features that I'm highlighting on here is some of my new little things on here. So as I get that off of here and things start to get closed down for the night, I'll leave you guys with a little bit of a slideshow of some cute bunnies. Cute bunnies. They're all the bunnies. Bunnies are, by the way, the best way of relieving any tension. So if any of the content tonight left you guys feeling anxious or annoyed or upset in any way, please look at the bunnies, smile, relax. Just remember, it's all just a dream. You're not really here. You will one day wake up before you're turned into a battery by machines because you're secretly in the Matrix. Anyway, I'm getting out of here, guys. Have a good night. We'll see you Saturday. Cheers. Have fun.